Who's in charge of the world? I guess that's quite a reasonable question to ask, isn't it? And I think it's probably particularly relevant at the moment when we see so much trouble and conflict in the world. Who is in charge? I guess some of us may argue that it's the politicians who are in charge. Putin, Trump. They're the ones that wield so much power. I remember back in 2020, Donald Trump, during his first spell as president, he declared that he had absolute authority over the governing of the USA. Is he in charge of the world? He probably thinks so. Or maybe we are so keen to control our own lives that, in effect, we think we control everything. I don't know if there's many of you that remember the children's television programme Malcolm in the Middle, but the theme tune was this. It says, "You're not the boss of me now." Is that how we think? We're our own bosses? Or maybe it's the devil. Jesus speaks of the devil as the ruler of this world. And to be honest, when we look around, how we see so difficult lives, such difficult problems, maybe it is the devil who's in charge. So who is in charge of the world? Well, the thing is, the consistent message of the Bible is that God is. God's in charge of the world, all of it. He's in charge of the good and the bad. And he's even in charge of who is and who isn't saved. And through our passage this morning, actually both passages, we will see how that is the case and that it's a good thing, even if we struggle to get our heads around it. Now, we're looking at some miracle births in the Bible at the moment as we run up to Christmas. And this week we're looking at the birth of Esau and Jacob. And through this story, we will see how God is truly in charge of everything. How he keeps all of his promises because he rules the world. And he does so through his sovereign power and his saving grace. And they're my kind of two big headings this morning. God rules through his sovereign power and by his saving grace. So let's look at the first of those 2 points. Because God keeps his promises because he rules through his sovereign power. Now, the story of Isaac and Esau and Jacob, well, they wouldn't look out of place in a soap opera, would they? They've got an EastEnders kind of feel about it. Family strife, dishonesty, deception, it's all there. However, if we get drawn into that side of the story too much, we can miss something that's very important. And that is, throughout the story that we read, everything that happens does so because of God's interaction with the story. First of all, in verse 21, we see how Rebecca gets pregnant because God grants Isaac's prayer. And all the family strife between the brothers, verse 23, is actually kindled through God's decree that the older shall serve the younger. From an earthly perspective, this may well look like the daily goings on of what can only be described as a dysfunctional family. However, everything that happens, all of it, is a result of God's sovereign will. We humans, we love to think we're in control, don't we? We love to think that we've mastered creation, science, engineering, medicine. We convince ourselves that humans can do anything, that we've tamed the natural world. And by doing so, we've become masters of our own destiny. Yet as the audience watching in on this soap opera as it unfolds, we become aware of what, or in fact who, is really driving events. And it's God. And we see that petty family politics was never going to get in the way of God's promises because God's sovereign. As mere humans, we simply cannot dictate the terms on which God will act, on which he will choose, on which he will keep and give his promises. God had made a promise to Abraham that from him, through his line, would come a great people, a great land, and a great blessing for the world. And God was going to keep his promise. God is sovereign, and that's a good thing. Because this line of promise ultimately finds its fulfillment in Jesus. And that's a good thing for us, isn't it? Because through faith in Jesus, we become children of the promise. We receive the covenant blessings without the covenant curse, because Jesus bore that curse for us. And as we look at the birth of Esau and Jacob, we can start to see the beginnings of what will become clear through the rest of Jacob's life. How God will sovereignly fulfill his promises. And we do so because actually Jacob points us towards Jesus. And that starts even before Jacob's born. If you look back to the previous chapter, chapter 24, we can see the story of how Abraham found a wife for his son, Isaac, which is Jacob's father. And he wanted a wife from his own people. And so Abraham sent his servant miles back to his homeland. And if you read the story, you'll see through God's miraculous providence, he found Rebekah. And Rebekah was a young woman, a virgin. And through her marriage to Isaac, she would be called to be the mother of the promised lion. And do you remember the remarkable response Rebekah gave when Abraham's servant asked her to return with him to marry Isaac, a man she'd never met, never even seen? Well, in chapter 24, verse 58, it says, "And they called Rebekah and said to her, 'Will you go with this man?' She said, 'I will go. I will go.'" Simply that. What remarkable obedience of a young virgin girl chosen to be the mother of God's promised line. And of course, as we approach Christmas, we can't help but see the parallels with Mary, the young virgin girl called by God to mother the one who would fulfill the line of promise, and that's Jesus. Do you remember her remarkable obedience? Luke 1:38. And Mary said, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. I will go." And so we start to see Jesus in this story, don't we? However, in our passage this morning, there's a problem. Because it turns out Rebekah's unable to have children. And actually, if we just read the story as it is, we might say, well, if God is sovereign and his providence is perfect, how can this happen? Rebekah can't have children. God's set up the path through which his promises will advance, only for it to seemingly fail at the first hurdle. And for 20 years, Isaac and Rebekah remain childless. That's 20 years of waiting, maybe 20 years of praying. How painful must that have been? It's not easy to trust God's sovereignty, is it? Because when you're trying for children, each month is a high of expectation and a pit of disappointment and sadness and increasing despair. Every month for 20 years. And while we can see from a cosmic perspective that God was holding all these events together in his hands, within our story, it's Isaac's prayer that starts an awful lot of family trouble, isn't it? Because God does answer his prayers. After 20 long years, Rebekah miraculously conceives. And God's sovereign power overrides and overrules all human plans and all human problems. However, if God is totally sovereign, it must mean that not only is he sovereign over the resolution, he's sovereign over the circumstances. Not only is he in charge of the solution, he's in charge of the problem. Everything happens, good or bad, according to God's sovereign power. So while he is sovereign over this miracle birth, it means he was also sovereign over their childlessness for that 20 years. Lamentations 3. Who has spoken and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? And that's a hard thing to come to terms with, isn't it? Because when you're suffering, when you're in pain, it's hard to reconcile that with a sovereign God. But it's also reassuring that nothing can happen to us, whatever that may be, nothing is outside of God's agency or his power. God has the ability to do it and the power to achieve it. God is never powerless in our situation because ultimately he is sovereign over it. And as we look at this family's struggles, we're similarly encouraged, aren't we? Because we can see through it that God is in control. His promises will be secure, the promises which find fulfillment in Jesus and to which we cling for our own salvation. They are secure, so we are secure. When Isaac prayed to God for a child in verse 21, God's sovereign power over the created order was displayed. A childless couple had a child. However, Rebecca's prayer in verse 22 shows us a different aspect of God's sovereignty. And it's his sovereignty over who and who doesn't belong to him. When Rebecca prays to the Lord, it's because we are told the children struggled within her. Now, the word struggled there is actually a bit of a lame translation because literally it means to crush or oppress. There was real conflicts going on between the brothers, even in Rebecca's womb. And when Rebecca asks why, his answer is surprising. Because he tells her that in her womb, Rebecca had not just two sons, but two nations. And those two nations would be divided against one another. Jacob was chosen to carry the promise and would later be renamed by God Israel and literally father the nation of Israel through his 12 sons. However, Esau would become another nation, the Edomites, and they would be the sworn enemies of Israel. And the Bible's full of occurrences where there is this conflict between the Edomites and the Israelites, between these two nations. However, there was something even perhaps more surprising, which would cause division between the boys. Verse 23. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. Now, culturally, at this time and in this place, it would have been absolutely unheard of for the older brother to be served by the younger. The firstborn had rights and privileges over all other children. So the expectation would have been that the firstborn would have been heir to all of God's promises. However, God says to Rebecca, it's not going to happen. It's the older who will serve the younger. And so, by God's sovereign power, the line of his promise will fall on the younger brother. God's divine plan, his own purposes, for his own glory, isn't determined by tradition, and it's not swayed by cultural convention, God will not bow to social privilege or status when he chooses who will inherit his promise. And what's more, God, when he chooses those to be his, well, it won't be determined by our bloodline either, or by anything we have done or will do in the future. That's what Paul says in our New Testament reading in Romans 9. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done neither good or bad, in order that God's promise of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. When God chooses who will be his, what we refer to as his election, he doesn't look at our works and choose us accordingly. He doesn't look through the telescope of time to see who will freely accept Christ and choose us on that basis. It's decided before we're even born, based purely on God's sovereign power. It's the kind of uncomfortable truth of God's election, isn't it? God chooses some for himself and not others. It's uncomfortable, but we can't escape it, because that's exactly what's happening here. And it's exactly what happens to all of us. It's a Bible truth. I think we all find that a bit hard, don't we? But it's the truth. But our second point may actually help us in this, because God's promises are received through his grace, and that's my second point. I have to be honest that I find that all babies look alike, don't they? It used to be said that babies all look like Winston Churchill. I'm not sure that's particularly kind, at least not for the girls. But one thing's for sure is that twins look even more alike. And yet in verses 25 to 28, we see that the sons born to Rebekah turn out to look very different. They're even different individuals. Esau, well, he was the kind of strapping outdoors type, wasn't he? Red and hairy at birth. He loved to hunt. What you'd call kind of a bloke's bloke. And Isaac loved Esau. Jacob, on the other hand, was a quiet, stay-at-home type. Bit of a mother's boy even. And Rebekah loved Jacob. And we can see straight away the tension that is caused by favouritism in a family. And when they were born, Esau was born first, followed by Jacob, who was grasping at his heel. And I suppose that Jacob coming out grasping Esau's heel is symbolic of what he would do later, by pulling his brother down from his blessing and birthright. I mean, it's clear that they're very different men with very different characters and very different destinies planned by God. And then we get to this extraordinary story in verses 29 to 34 about the birthright. And you have to be honest that neither of the brothers come out of it covered in glory, do they? Esau, well, he was a flawed man. He really wasn't interested in much more than his physical needs, was he? Mainly food, either killing it, cooking it, as we'll see later, or eating it. And he comes across as somewhat shallow, concerned only with his own needs and desires. He's obviously impulsive, driven by the passions of the moment, with no concerns for the long term. We're actually told later on that his dishonours his parents, and the book of Hebrews describes him as sexually immoral. It's not a pretty sight, is it? But worst of all, Esau had little or no regard for God and for God's promises. Because we see how he was prepared to trade his birthright, everything that he had in his inheritance from Isaac, everything that could have been his, he traded it all for a simple bowl of red stew. And it gets rather dramatic with Esau, doesn't it? Because he may well have been hungry, but he wasn't about to die, as he claimed. He just wanted instant gratification. He just wanted to satisfy his desires. And while the two brothers fought it out in life, just as they had in their mother's womb, as to who was the stronger, who would ultimately serve the other, they were in fact only playing out the purposes of God. Because as we've seen, their destinies had already been decided by God's power. And in verse 30, Esau was given the name Edom. Now, Edom literally means red. He came out red. He sold his birthright for red stew. His descendants became known as Edomites, red people. And it was they who became the nation who were enemies of God. And that was the destiny God chose for Esau, an enemy of God. And if we're honest, the world's probably full of Esau's today, isn't it? Those who despise God and his promises. Those people who care for their earthly satisfaction and physical needs more than an eternal life as part of a promised people in a promised land under God's promised blessings. And the sad thing is that the vast majority of them aren't militant atheists. They're just ordinary people going about their ordinary lives who just can't be bothered with God. He's just not important to them. They reject him in favour of his own desires. Yet by rejecting God and his promises, they are in fact enemies of God. They're Esau's. But what of Jacob? No, he's not much better, is he? He seems rather self-seeking, manipulative. He certainly takes advantage of his brother's desperation and takes what he wants. And he doesn't really trust God to do the right thing either, does he? Because instead he connives, he uses human means to try and manipulate the situation into one that's favourable to him. However, Jacob does at least believe in a future. Despite his sinful behaviour, Jacob understands that his satisfaction, in contrast to Esau's, is deferred. That resisting instant gratification will produce a future satisfaction. And despite being born to the lowly estate of the second-born, he was raised to a place of honour, a role that he was destined by God to play from before his birth. It was, after all, him and not Esau who would carry the promises of God. And yet, despite being the child of promise, he was not protected from trouble, but was born to it. He was despised, rejected, hated, ended up in the wilderness. Yet eventually, of course, he would have 12 sons who would constitute the tribe of Israel, through whom God's blessings was to come. That was the destiny that God had chosen for Jacob, that he would receive the blessings and the promises of God and bless the earth through Israel. So two very different men, two very different destinies which were both chosen by God. But why two such different endings for two similarly sinful men? Jacob and Esau were both sinners. They were both deeply flawed individuals. And actually, neither of them deserved the promise of God. So why was Jacob blessed and Esau cursed? Well, as we saw earlier, it's because God chooses who will be his and who will not, because it's by his sovereign choice alone. And while we may be affronted by this whole idea of election, of God choosing some for salvation and some not, we may even think it's not fair. We're probably all tempted to that conclusion. But if we're honest, when we look at these two brothers side by side, it's a wonder that God could love either of them. And it's a miracle that he could choose either of them. Because the real shock of God's election is that he chooses anyone at all. Because we're all Esau's. We are all by nature enemies of God. We are all sinners, and we all deserve to be passed over for God's favour, for God's election. It's only by God's incredible grace that anyone is chosen. Because if we were to appoint people to God's kingdom based on merit, then his kingdom would be very, very empty indeed. We could never merit the electing hand of God on our lives. God chooses according to his grace alone, while we were yet unborn and had done nothing good or bad. But here's the big picture. It's here that we can now see what's going on and what the sad story of these two brothers is pointing us to. Because the Bible speaks of humanity through two men. Not Jacob and Esau, but Adam and Jesus. Adam, God's firstborn man. Jesus, God's secondborn, the second Adam, as the Bible refers to him as. And all of humanity is ultimately either under Adam or Jesus. And the story of Esau and Jacob is meant to point us to this reality. Think back over the story of Jacob, and you will see Jesus. Not only through the circumstances surrounding his birth, as we've seen, but through his life. The second son, lowly born, yet born to be raised to high honour. Troubled, despised, rejected. Chosen to not only carry, but fulfill God's promises to bless the world. However, in Esau, we can see Adam. Have you noticed the similarity between the word Adam and Edom? Well, they both have the same Hebrew root word, because whilst we use the name Adam to mean son, to mean man, the root of it actually comes from the word red, because it's man from the red earth. Adam is red. Esau was red. Adam was God's firstborn. Adam rejected God's promises to satisfy his own desires. Therefore, Adam came under the curse of God. And all of those who come from Adam are by nature enemies of God. And that's all of us. We were all born to Adam's race. And so we are naturally enemies of God. We're all Esau's, Edomites, red men. That's how the world is. However, this is where God's rule, by his sovereign power and his saving grace, is most perfectly seen. Because before grace is given, everyone who has ever lived, apart from Jesus, everyone is in bondage to sin and death. We are all in Adam. However, by God's grace, through Jesus Christ, we can escape the power of sin and death. In Christ, we get a free transfer, as it were, from Adam's team to Jesus' team. Well, of course, I say a free transfer. It was free for us. because it was by God's free grace. However, it was Jesus who paid the transfer fee. It was he who paid the price by God's grace. You see, we were in truth the spiritual heirs of Esau and deserving of all the judgments against God's enemies. But we were found by a mercy we did not seek, and we have been shown a love we did not deserve, grace. And that's because we have a brother who is better than Jacob, even though our sin makes us less deserving than Esau. And because of our sinfulness and our inability to save ourselves, the only hope for us is in him, in the atoning death of Jesus. God in Jesus lovingly suffered in our place and paid the price for our sin. God's promises are kept under his sovereign power, and they are received through his saving grace. A grace that's not earned, but which is shown to the undeserving. A grace that comes at God's expense and at God's direction, and not our commands. And that grace is ours if we're in Christ. Let's pray.